We've had an easterly wind across the UK through much of this week. It's brought a biting chill as well as a lot of cloud, a lot of grey skies. But are things going to change in time for next week, in time for half term for many of us? Well, let's have a look. And starting off, and if you saw the deep dive with Honor on Tuesday, you'll have seen a chart similar to this. It is our probabilistic pressure trend for the next 2 weeks, and it shows the most likely pressure setup across the UK. The reds indicating higher pressure being most likely, and then the change to blue indicates that around the beginning part towards the middle part of next week, a change to lower pressure seems the most likely scenario. Not a guarantee, but the general trend towards lower pressure looks quite likely. And you can see as we go back in time looking at previous model runs, there has been relatively good agreement of this transition, but exactly when it happens, that's where there's been some uncertainty. It kind of has been delayed a bit as we've gone through the last couple of days. If we look at a similar chart, but this time the zonal trend, so whether our air is coming from the west or east, and the reds indicating the easterly winds, which we will stick with as we go through the end of the week, through much of the weekend and into the beginning part of next week across the bulk of the UK really, but a westerly is then likely to develop. And there's been a bit better agreement in terms of when we're going to see that transition from an easterly to a westerly. Around Tuesday, Wednesday time next week looks like the most likely time, but worth bearing in mind the most recent model runs have actually become a little bit less certain about this, gone with a kind of a neutral setup for Wednesday and Thursday. No strong sign as to whether it would be a westerly or easterly on those days. So the thing to take from this is, yes, we are likely to see a change from an easterly to a westerly, from high pressure being most dominant to low pressure taking a bit more control. But exactly when it happens, how strong it's going to be, well, that's where we still need to firm up the detail. But if we look at the picture that we have across the nearby area at the moment, and well, we have had high pressure over Scandinavia. That's shifted a little bit towards the southeast, but nonetheless, it is still dominating our weather, and it's still bringing an easterly wind in across many parts. That easterly wind has then dragged in some pretty chilly air, not especially cold for the time of year. Other easterlies have been much colder than this, but we've talked about that in previous videos. But as you can see, cold air across many places, and with a lot of cloud, particularly by day, our temperatures have been pretty suppressed. But as we go through, well, the rest of Wednesday and into Thursday, I think Thursday is going to bring a greater chance of seeing a few bright or sunny breaks compared to some recent days, particularly across northern western parts of Scotland, some breaks here, and even elsewhere, a few breaks developing, perhaps away from the southwest where it's going to turn cloudier and windier as we go through the day. There will be a few showers around here or there, but nothing particularly heavy. Most places staying largely dry. As we go into Friday, we do have a system coming in from the southwest, the start of that change to something a bit more unsettled or low pressure related, and that westerly coming in. And as that pushes across parts of Northern Ireland, we could see some snow, perhaps even a little bit of freezing rain pushing in, and then also some wet weather feeding in across parts of the southwest. But further across more central eastern parts, it's staying dry, and we're sticking with the influence of that high pressure to the east of us, and so it is going to stay, well, quite cloudy and quite chilly still as well. That being said, if we look at our 850 hectopascal temperatures, and as we go through the weekend, as this system from the southwest pushes its way northeastwards, we're also going to see the temperatures at the 850 hectopascals layer rising. So we're going to see some warmer air pushing in. Now, 850 hectopascals, that's around 1,500 meters up, so not at the surface, and that's important. I'll come on to that, well, now really, because actually, if we look at our freezing levels, and the freezing level is the height above sea level at which we see temperatures of around 0, so freezing, and they play an important part in whether or not we see any wintry precipitation, so some sleet or snow as opposed to rain. And actually, if we look at our freezing levels across parts of Scotland, down the eastern side of England, some northern parts of England as well, we have the freezing levels around the surface. And so what this suggests is, yes, at around 1,500 meters up, we have something a bit warmer coming in, but underneath it, closer to the surface, we have some colder air plunging through. And now that's important because it brings the risk of some freezing rain. Here's a tephigram for York on Saturday, and it shows this. Now, a tephigram is a profile through the atmosphere for a set place showing the temperature. And what we can see is this line here is our 0 degree isotherm. So anything to the right of this is above freezing, anything to the left or is below freezing. And yes, higher up the temperature is below freezing, as you would expect. But As we get closer to the surface, but not especially close, it then hits this warm nose where temperatures are a little bit above freezing. And then it drops down again. So as we get close to the surface still, we then hit a layer of freezing air, so where the temperature is below freezing. What this means then, we have our snow or precipitation falling. It's likely to hit this warm nose and turn to rain. But as this rain then falls into this colder layer just before it reaches the surface, it's going to become super cooled. It's not going to freeze because it's traveling too quickly and it doesn't have anything to freeze on until it reaches the surface. And so this is when we end up with freezing rain. It can cause some very icy conditions and could cause some problems. So I wanted to show you this just to highlight that there is the risk through this weekend and into the beginning of next week of various spells of freezing rain, mixed in with some sleet and snow at times as well. That's because we have various swathes of wet weather coming in from the southwest, and there's still going to be some uncertainty as to how far northeast they get and how far any colder air ducking underneath it comes in from the east as well. Bit of uncertainty about those boundaries. So exactly where we see the rain pushing through and where we see some sleet, some snow, some freezing rain, little bit uncertain still, but across parts of Scotland, down the eastern side of England, northern England, this is where we have the greatest risk of seeing some snow and some freezing rain. Worth bearing in mind that as we go through the weekend into the beginning of next week, rainfall totals will build up across some western parts. The rain doesn't look like it's going to be especially heavy. There's not a great deal of forcing in it at the moment, and so, well, it's just the fact that it's going to be quite persistent that could cause some problems. So we could see some relatively high totals when we look at the 2 to 3 day period through Saturday to Monday. In terms of snowfall amounts, and yes, this could cause a little bit of disruption. Doesn't look especially problematic at the moment, but any snow, any freezing rain can cause some issues. So we may need to issue some warnings for these nearer the time. Now, to look at the type of precipitation that we could see falling, another chart that I have here is for Harrogate as we go through the next few days. And it shows the type of precipitation, so whether it's rain, sleet or snow, that we're likely to see. Now the greens indicate that rain is most likely through Wednesday, and then it's turning largely dry as we go through Thursday, Friday, and then into the weekend it looks a bit wetter. It could be a wintry mix, so there could be some rain, could be some snow indicated by the blues. And the thing that I wanted to highlight is the fact that there are some orangey reds, which go with the idea of some freezing drizzle, some freezing rain, perhaps, as we go into the beginning of next week. So Saturday, Sunday, Monday, all of these days could bring some freezing rain or drizzle to some places. So that's just something to keep in mind. But looking further ahead, and as we go through next week, let's look at the most likely setups, because, well, it's quite important in terms of when we're going to see this transition from what we have currently to something a bit more zonal coming in from the west, and a bit more low pressure related. And if we look at the most likely setup for next Tuesday, and it goes with the idea of high pressure somewhere towards the east of us near Scandinavia, but also low pressure getting closer towards us. And so this would lead to quite a southerly flow. And so we may start to see our temperatures lifting a little bit, and we may start to see something a bit more unsettled coming in from the west. Meanwhile, towards the east, you have a greater chance of staying that little bit dry. If we do get systems coming through, I would expect the east to see some rain at times, but it's always going to be wettest towards western areas. And actually, if we run through next week, this most likely setup is the most likely setup for every day next week. So sticking with the idea that high pressure somewhere towards the east, low pressure somewhere towards the west, and then we're sandwiched in between. And exactly where the boundary is, well, that's where the question mark is, and that will play a pivotal role in the weather that we can expect as we go through next week. We can see that if we actually look at the second most likely setup for next week. And actually, starting off on Tuesday and even Wednesday, it's relatively similar. The high pressure is actually slightly closer towards us, so that would allow for maybe the colder weather that we have at the moment, like the cloudy cold weather that we've got used to through this week, could return a bit and push in from the east, with the low pressure a bit further out towards the west, so less of an influence of that. But as we go further ahead through next week, by Thursday, the second most likely setup is for low pressure to be more dominant. It's towards the northwest of the UK, not especially close, but this could bring something markedly wetter, windier and milder as we go towards the back end of next week. Now, obviously, this isn't the most likely setup, but nonetheless, there is a reasonable chance that we could see something more more unsettled arriving as we go through the back end of next week. Through Friday, Saturday, the second most likely setups are the same as on Thursday. Another way of looking at this is this chart from ECMWF, well, our postage stamps, showing various members from ECMWF, their output for next Friday. And they kind of go with that same idea that there is uncertainty as to exactly what's going to happen. And if I just pick a few to take as an example, and if we look at member 4, this goes with the idea that we have that milder air coming in and pushing its way across the UK and a bit further on, and this would lead to something a bit more unsettled, definitely more unsettled than we have at the moment. So some wetter, perhaps windier weather, but a rise in our temperatures too. It's worth bearing in mind this is wet bulb potential temperature that this chart is showing. But member 5 hints that the cold air towards the east of us won't retreat entirely, would still have the influence of high pressure through until next Friday. And so anything a bit milder, a bit more unsettled would kind of be confined just to western parts, eastern areas, sticking with the cooler, drier, colder, drier weather that we have at the moment. Meanwhile, member 8 goes in the other direction in as much as it either keeps the cold air across us and then we don't see much coming in from the west as we go through next week, or it will allow for something to come through and then actually the cold air towards the east returns as we go through the beginning or end of next week. So there's a lot to play for in exactly what's going to happen. I think we can be fairly certain that a change is likely, going from the high pressure, the easterly that we have at the moment, to something a bit more milder, unsettled, coming in from the west instead. But exactly how quickly that transition happens and how far it spreads across the UK, that's where the uncertainty is. So definitely worth staying up to date. You can do so by making sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. We'll keep you informed with all the details. Bye-bye.